Welcome to Military Analytics. Bakhmut in the eastern region of Donetsk has been at the center of speculation about Ukraine's much-anticipated counteroffensive, which has been one of the bloodiest battles of the war for months. But the latest news from the Bakhmut front indicates that the tide has turned to the Ukrainian side. Russia said yesterday it faced Ukrainian attacks on a 60-mile stretch of the front near the besieged city of Bakhmut. About 40 tanks and more than 1,000 Ukrainian soldiers participated in offensive operations in the direction of Soledar in the Donetsk region, the Russian Defense Ministry said in a statement. The Russian Defense Ministry also stated that 26 attacks were carried out by the Ukrainian armed forces, involving more than 1,000 soldiers, up to 40 tanks, and other military and special technology. Ukraine has not yet made a statement on the subject, but some Ukrainian officials claim that Russian casualties reached enormous proportions after these offensive operations. Thanks to the Ukraine war, the Russian army is no longer likely to be an effective combat force. It is becoming more and more unlikely that the Russian army in Ukraine will carry out successful operations as a combined ground force expanded too widely to be an effective fighting force. The Russian army is now mostly made up of reservists who are poorly trained and dependent on outdated equipment. Additionally, many units are below optimum strength, and as a result, the Kremlin can only conduct infantry-based operations. So, did the Russian army die in Ukraine? The harshest assessment of the situation of the Russian military in Ukraine came from the latest UK Ministry of Defense intelligence update in the UK MOD report. On paper, the Russian Combined Forces Group in Ukraine is organized similarly to the fighting force 46 days ago. Russia's combat power still consists of more than 200,000 personnel organized in about 70 combat regiments and brigades divided into 5 force groups. But now it is struggling with the freedom to conduct limited air operations, it said. The most notable difference in Russia's combat power is in the caliber of its troops. The Russian army, which attacked Ukraine for no reason in February 2022, consisted largely of professional soldiers equipped with modern vehicles and could, therefore, take part in complex joint operations. As many of these units suffer serious casualties, the military is increasingly dependent on untrained personnel and outdated equipment. The UK Department of Defence's assessment of the Russian army's situation echoes what General Christopher G. Cavoli, commander of the US forces in Europe, said at the Lennart Meri conference held in Tallinn, Estonia. However, Cavoli had stated that it would be premature to suggest that the Russian army was an exhausted force. Cavoli said the Russian military's death in Ukraine is something that needs to be looked at very closely. It is very easy to think that the Russian army has collapsed or is in big trouble, but in fact, it is only because the army is disorganized, he said. General Cavoli added that Russia's ground forces were significantly eroded and also suggested that the Kremlin was facing several problems. Russia lost a lot of people and a lot of equipment. On the other hand, it also recruited many people into the army. Although the ground forces of the Russian army are larger today than they were at the beginning of this conflict, this size consists entirely of untrained soldiers. So, are the untrained soldiers the cause of the increase in Russia's casualties in Ukraine? Statements on the Russian military's situation came just a day after the Ukrainian army reported that it had liberated an area of 16.85 kilometers squared around the city of Bakhmut in the Donbas region. It also noted that there were limited, successful Ukrainian counterattacks north of Kremlin, just west of Bakhmut, allegedly by Russian military bloggers, reducing the ability of Russian forces to intercept near a key ground communication line for Ukrainian troops operating nearby in recent clashes. 2 Russian military commanders were killed. The Russian Ministry of Defense announced that the commander of the 4th Motor Rifle Brigade, Vyacheslav Makarov, was injured and died while being evacuated from the battlefield. Also, Colonel Yevgeny Brovko, deputy commander of the Army Corps for Military Political Affairs, died from multiple shrapnel wounds, Russian officials reported. The news of the 2 officers' deaths comes after reports on Saturday that the Russian Air Force lost 4 air units, including an Su-34 fighter bomber and an Su-35 air superiority fighter, as well as Mi-8 transport helicopters. In light of these developments, Russian forces in and around Bakhmut began to withdraw after a series of local Ukrainian counterattacks. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has just announced that they will have to postpone the offensive operations because they are not ready yet. But information from the front shows us the opposite. So, will Russia withdraw from Bakhmut? From the beginning of the week, Russian troops began to withdraw from their positions in and around Bakhmut. Ukrainian forces are pressing hard, using artillery and mechanized infantry to liberate the land. According to satellite images, Ukrainian forces liberated at least half a mile. The zone has some tactical significance because it was a Russian bridgehead on the west bank of the Donetsk-Donbass Canal, which marked the front line in parts of the sector. UK military intelligence said in its latest report on the war. The 72nd Separate Motor Rifle Brigade of the Russian Army became one of the units that lost ground. UK military intelligence reported that the 72nd Motor Rifle Brigade, a fairly new unit formed in the autumn, suffered heavy losses in the fighting in Donbass and persisted with claims of demoralization and limited combat effectiveness. Its deployment in such a challenging and operationally important sector demonstrates Russia's serious lack of combat units. UK military intelligence noted Ukrainian forces are far from liberating all of Bakhmut, but any progress that forces the Russian forces to withdraw bodes well. Russian commanders also have to fear the morale of their troops. The protracted duration of the war, the setbacks, and extremely heavy losses created the perfect cocktail for disobedience in the Russian ranks. The Russian army must be careful that the retreat does not turn into a rout. Also, Ukraine's unofficial counterattacks show that Russian forces are far from taking the town. The fight for Bakhmut will soon be a year old, and it has become by far the fiercest conflict of the Ukrainian war. The Ministry of Defense of Ukraine reported that the Russian army has lost about 200,000 soldiers since the beginning of the war. During this time period, the Russian army lost about 3,800 main battle tanks, 7,400 armored fighting vehicles, 3,100 artillery systems, 570 multiple rocket launchers, 320 air defense systems, 310 combat aircraft, 300 helicopters, 2,700 drones, 1,000 cruise missiles, and 18 warships. Considering these losses, it would not be correct to say that the Russian army died in Ukraine, but it would be too optimistic to say that it is alive. Especially the Russian losses that took place this week caused great damage to the army, both materially and morally. And the information from the Battle of Bakhmut shows that the Russian army may have to withdraw from Bakhmut in the near future. This, in turn, could destroy the entire war effort of the Russian army, and thus Russian President Vladimir Putin could knock on Ukraine's door with a ceasefire. Russia is now facing one of the most equipped armies in Europe. Yes, the Ukrainian army has become a complete deterrent for Russia, thanks to the striking military and financial support of the US and Western Europe. Undoubtedly, the United States under Joe Biden was one of the countries that had the most important share in the Ukrainian forces' attainment of this power. Thanks to US military support, the Ukrainian forces now consist of at least a dozen brigades. According to some intelligence sources, the armed forces of Ukraine have 18 brigades. 9 of the Ukrainian army's brigades were armed by Western allies, according to US intelligence documents leaked earlier this month. In addition, in the last period, a total of more than 230 tanks, more than 1,000 other armored vehicles, and 150 field artillery units were supplied to the Ukrainian army. The most effective step in tank aid was taken in Germany. Representatives from nearly 50 countries discussed systems and supply issues for Kiev at the Ramstein talks held in Germany hosted by the United States on management. This meeting had a great impact on the world agenda. After the meeting, U.S. Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin announced that M1 Abrams tanks were recently sent to the Ukrainian army. U.S. Abrams tanks were spotted at the training ground in Nowodib in southeastern Poland. Currently, it is estimated that some of these tanks are used on the front lines in Ukraine. This striking U.S. military support is expected to play a key role in helping the Ukrainian army win this war. Because the M1 Abrams is a very powerful third-generation main battle tank in the inventory of the U.S. Army and Marine Corps. The M1 Abrams is a tank developed for the U.S. Modern Armored Warfare Program. Equipped with a 1,500 HP gas turbine engine, sophisticated composite armor, and an isolated ammunition storage cabin in a separate explosion cell for personal safety. That's why these war beasts of the US and ready to raise Russia's military losses in trench and tank wars in Ukraine far above record levels. The US also announced that it will train the Ukrainian army for M1 Abrams tanks. The United States will begin training Ukrainian forces in how to operate and maintain Abrams tanks in the coming weeks and will continue to step up efforts to get them to the battlefield as soon as possible. The critical announcement was made by the U.S. Secretary of Defense, Lloyd Austin. The decision was announced as defense leaders from Europe and around the world met at Ramstein Air Base in an effort to coordinate the delivery of weapons and other equipment to Ukraine. According to U.S. officials, 31 tanks will arrive at the Grafen War Training Ground in Germany at the end of May, and the troops will begin training in a few weeks. Officials stated that the troop training will take about 10 weeks. Also, according to U.S. officials, about 250 Ukrainian soldiers will be trained. Some of the Ukrainian soldiers who will participate in the training will learn to use tanks, while others will learn to repair and maintain them. Additional training on how to fight and maneuver tanks can also be given after the first 10 weeks. Training tanks will not be those supplied to Ukraine for use in the war against Russia. Instead, 31 M1A1 battle tanks are being upgraded in the United States, and these will go to the front lines when they are ready. The goal of the U.S. is to train Ukrainian troops until the refurbished Abrams tanks are ready so they can jump into battle immediately. So far, the U.S. has trained 8,800 Ukrainian soldiers who have returned to the battlefield, and roughly 2,500 more are currently training. Their training included everything from basic weapons training to how to conduct combat operations and maintenance and repair of equipment. From now on, the U.S. wants the Ukrainian armed forces to be one of the most equipped armies in Europe by training many more Ukrainian soldiers on battle tanks. Western allies are increasing supplies of military equipment to Ukraine, which is preparing to face a possible renewed offensive by Russia this spring. Germany hesitated for months on whether to send its tanks to Ukraine and eventually succumbed to international pressure. German Defense Minister Boris Pistorius has previously announced that Ukrainian tank crews have started training on Leopard 1 tanks, and 80 of these vehicles will be gradually transferred to Ukraine in 2023. Meanwhile, Germany signed a memorandum of understanding with Poland and Ukraine to establish a maintenance center for Kiev's Leopard 2 tank fleet in Poland, close to the Ukrainian border. The German defense minister, Boris Pistorius, told reporters that his military center will cost €150 to €200 million per year. Meanwhile, hundreds of Western infantry fighting vehicles have arrived in Ukraine so far this month, including British Challenger 2 and Leopard 2 main battle tanks, as well as US-made Bradleys and German-made Martyrs. Photos and striking data showing the arrival of these tanks in Ukraine had a wide impact on the world press. According to the footage, NATO tanks were on their way to Ukraine before major counterattacks against Russian forces. In addition, the Canadian Armed Forces posted photos on social media of German-made Leopard 2 tanks landing in southwest Poland on the last leg of their journey to Ukraine as part of Canada's commitment to ship 8 of its main battle tanks to Ukraine. These tanks were transported under the Royal Canadian Air Force CC-07 Globemaster III plan. Canadian Leopard 2s arrived in southwestern Poland on April 11th, but photos of the passage of tanks have been published in recent weeks alongside Canada. Spain was one of the countries that sent Leopard main battle tanks to the Ukrainian army. 6 Leopard tanks left Spain and were on their way to Ukraine to increase their military capacity. These tanks were loaded on the cargo ship and transported to Poland by sea. The Spanish Leopard tank shipped from Santander belonged to an older model type, the Leopard 2A4. These tanks have been out of service for a long time and have been stored in a warehouse near Zaragoza since 2012. Spanish Leopard tanks were refurbished and tested for battlefield use before being sent to Ukraine. In addition to sending Leopard battle tanks to the Ukrainian army, Spain was also appreciated for training them. The Spanish Ministry of Defense reported that the training of Ukrainian soldiers in the country for the Leopard 2A4 type tanks was carried out successfully. The Spanish Ministry of Defense stated that the training of 10 tank crews was carried out in special training areas provided by the Toledo Training Coordination Center in Zaragoza. The team of 10 Ukrainian tankmen became the first military group to complete special training courses in Spain. On the other hand, military analysts and Ukrainian politicians consider Western tanks and combat vehicles to be game changers for success against Russian forces. After the Russian spring offensive failed to make any serious gains in the eastern regions, Ukraine is now preparing for major counterattacks with the arrival of Western battle tanks in the next few weeks. Western military equipment is believed to be essential for Ukraine's attempts to push back Russian forces in the occupied territories towards its southern and eastern borders. The Ukrainians are expected to make major attempts to divide the Russian land corridor, according to Alexei Danilov, chief of Ukraine's security services. Only a small fraction of Ukrainian officials know the details of the imminent counterattack against Russia. We have reached the number of people Alexei Danilov meant for you. Only 5 Ukrainian officials are aware of the exact plans. While information on how the counterattacks might take place is kept secret, yes, it is not known whether this secret plan will lead Ukraine to a decisive victory, but it seems certain that these curious counterattack plans of the Ukrainian forces will make a lot of noise. Equipped with less modern T-72 and 90 tanks, Russian troops may struggle to defend against advancing Ukrainian forces, but the muddy ground and relative lack of surprise have some officials worried. But if the Ukrainian army can advance towards the occupied city of Melitopol as part of its grand offensive plans, it may cut off the Russian supply lines from the Crimean Peninsula to the Donbass, where most of the fighting is taking place. The Russians, on the other hand, can develop defensive measures against these plans of the Ukrainians. In fact, defensive intelligence reported that Russia has finished building a 3-layered defense along the 75-mile front line in Zaporizhia province. It is thought that preparations are underway in Melitopol for a structure similar to this defense line, because recently released satellite images show Dragon Teeth anti-tank lines running southeast along the 7 highway in front of Melitopol. But the Ukrainians continue to amass many more of their soldiers on the front lines with the battle tanks they procured from the West and the USA. In addition, military units that are more equipped for Western tanks are accelerating the counterattack plans of the Ukrainian army. A critical move came from Ukraine. The Russian army has no chance in Luhansk in response to this move. The Ukrainian army has cornered Russia in every sense. Ukrainian soldiers have completely seized the territorial advantage with this. But after these critical developments, Putin's policies have undergone a huge change in the final stages of the Russian-Ukrainian war. The Russian army faced enormous difficulties. One of the main reasons for this was the large amount of support the Ukrainian army received. But it was also very important that the Russian army faced many demoralizing developments. Many soldiers on Putin's side are complaining about their current situation, and this once again showed the world how much superiority the Ukrainian army now has over the Russians. And this Ukrainian operation has reverberated around the world. The Ukrainian army has gained a huge advantage over the Russians, especially as a result of the steps taken in the field of intelligence. Ukrainian soldiers came very close to victory as a result of the Ukrainian army being informed before the Russian army makes any move. It allows Ukraine to win the victory in regions such as Luhansk. In this operation, the Ukrainian army has once again declared its superiority over the Russians. But at this point, one of Ukraine's most critical weapons came into play, and the operation made the whole world groan with the footsteps of a great victory. At first, the Ukrainian army was taking many steps to regain control near Luhansk. But when the information came that the Russian troops in this area had been transferred to other areas, the Ukrainian army realized that now was the right time to attack, and it mobilized a very large team to plan a direct attack against the Russians. This scoop would put a complete stop to Russia's dominance in many regions. The Ukrainian army first decided to send a group of soldiers to carry out a false flag attack near this region since it was acting as a raiding force. It began to anticipate the possible moves that the Russian troops might make beforehand. The right moment to attack was when the Russian army started a massive deployment of troops to many areas that were about to be lost, such as Bakhmut and Soledar. Ukrainian troops immediately began to move in a concentrated effort towards these points. Detachments were sent to the critical headquarters in Luhansk and the Russian epicenter for intelligence, while Ukrainian troops were deployed nearby in parallel. And the Ukrainian army is now on the move for its biggest victory against Russia. After completing its preparations, the Ukrainian army mobilized to move towards the Russians. The Russian army, many of whom had already left Luhansk, was at a loss as the advantages of the nearby area came to the fore. Due to Russia's weakness in this region, Ukrainian troops began to make major breakthroughs against the Russians under heavy pressure in these latest operations. First of all, the Ukrainian army mobilized certain parts of the army, which it divided into units by making hit-and-run attacks on critical points here. Along with this, the Russian army started to attack Ukraine by underestimating its power. This allowed Ukraine to make a move that turned everything to its advantage, and the Ukrainian army dealt the biggest blow to the Russians. The Ukrainian army directed a very large part of its troops to this region. The Russian troops, which were already very few in number, did not take the Ukrainian offensive in this area seriously. Realizing this, Ukraine launched an initial attack with a small contingent, and the Russians fired harassing shots at them in an attempt to lure them into an offensive. The Russian army fell into this trap and started to open fire on the Ukrainians in order not to lose the advantage in the region. When the Ukrainian army fired back, the Russian soldiers faced a worse development they have ever experienced. The Ukrainian army, on the other hand, brought a large number of HIMARS into range near this area in order to take complete control in this region. Immediately afterwards, it started firing missiles at Russian headquarters, which were marked on the map. During this time, as the fighting continued, Russian soldiers, startled by the successive explosions, suffered a huge loss of morale. The Ukrainian army, on the other hand, has now mobilized to deal the hardest blow to the Russians. Ukraine launched an offensive against the Russians with all of its troops in this region, and the Ukrainian army's dominance in this region has become absolute one after another. Russian soldiers began to surrender to Ukraine, although the remaining part wanted to make different moves in the area where they were deployed. The Ukrainian army did not allow this. Even the tanks that Russia used to attack this region were blown up by armor-piercing shells. And the Ukrainian army has now dealt the biggest blow to Russian dominance in Luhansk. The vast majority of Russian soldiers surrendered. This news reached Russia through the fleeing soldiers. With this, the Ukrainian army proved that it is now the head of the Russian army in many areas. Putin's reaction to this situation resonated all over the world. Russia's imbalanced actions in recent days had already caused serious damage. However, the steps taken against the Ukrainian army have made things even worse. In his desperation, Putin has moved to find common ground with his allies. China, a country with which he had been in frequent contact since the beginning, was crucial. But the answer Putin received from China complicated everything. There has been cooperation between China and Russia for a very long time, and put into action to use this cooperation against Ukraine shortly before going to war with the Ukrainian army. Putin signed a treaty of permanent friendship with China and started taking steps to win the war. But in return, there was not the slightest help or solution from China to the problems. Putin was left with very serious problems and tensions, and many of the problems that this situation has brought have completely upset Putin's plans. The Russian soldiers who had predicted that many countries in the world would be in tension and that there would be a big war now faced the biggest problem because Putin did not even receive support from his biggest ally, and it evolved into much bigger problems. Together with this, the Ukrainian army is now in the most advantageous position against the Russians, especially thanks to the steps taken in foreign policy and the victory of the Ukrainian army. Russian soldiers are cornered. If it continues in this way, the Russian army, which does not have the slightest chance against the Ukrainian army, has started to make plans to surrender. Then this bad news comes to Putin. It is expected that comprehensive changes and renewal movements within the army will be on the agenda. But even worse news for Putin came from the US. The Russian army will no longer be able to breathe easily in the Ukrainian region, and this exhaustion of the Russian army will prepare the ground for everything to continue in favor of Ukraine. But at this point, the comments made by war analysts will show how the war is progressing and will resonate all over the world. According to war analysts, the Ukrainian army has started to take the upper hand in many areas. This paves the way for Ukraine to win the war in a short period of time. If this continues, Ukrainian soldiers will have much greater opportunities against Russia, and the Russian army has realized how unfavorable it is to Ukraine in every sense, realizing that if things continue as they have been in recent times, Russia will not be able to reach Ukraine's points both in politics and in ammunition and vehicles. Russian soldiers have started to surrender to Ukraine piece by piece. If things continue in this way, a large number of soldiers are expected to continue their successes against Ukraine with the demoralization caused by the situation. The ground will be prepared for the Russian army to face very serious problems. If this continues, it will lead to Putin's fall from power and his resignation.